And joining me now is Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida. Donalds, by the way, introduced DeSantis at his election night victory party in November. Last month, he became one of 11 Florida congressional Republicans to endorse Donald Trump. Congressman Donalds, welcome to Meet the Press.
It's good to be with you, Chuck.
Before we start with the politics, sort of the political junkie conversation, I want to talk about the debt ceiling. You're a member of the Freedom Caucus on here. Where are you going to be comfortable with a deal that you probably personally won't like, but it's a deal that sort of maybe progressives don't like and the Freedom Caucus doesn't like, but it can pass? Are you going to be able to accept a deal like that?
Chuck, to be blunt with you, we're not really sure what deal is even on the table. The White House is not serious. They came out with a proposal to spend another $30 billion more than they already wanted to spend. They're not taking a look at the reality of where our country is fiscally. Look, Joe Biden is saying that he's cut $1.7 trillion from the deficit, but everybody's saying that's not true. That's what he actually has done is he's $1 trillion over what CBO was projecting spending was going to be, because after all of the COVID spending in the last year of President Trump, that Congress wasn't going to extend that, and Joe Biden did. So we're in a situation right now where the only plan in Washington has been passed by the House of Representatives. It's the only plan. Joe Biden's not serious at the negotiating table. I've talked with my colleagues who are in that room. So at this point, really the question is, what's the Senate going to do? Where's Chuck Schumer in all this? Because the Senate has not done any work at all, and Joe Biden has not done any work at all.
I want to get you to respond to something former President Trump said about the debt ceiling in 2019. Take a listen.
I can't imagine anybody ever even thinking of using the debt ceiling as a negotiating wedge.
Why don't you agree with him on this?
Well, first of all, he also said the other day on a rival network that he said that when he was president, and when asked why he wasn't saying it now, he said because he's not president. Listen, Donald Trump is always negotiating.
Do you realize how absurd that sounds?
That is not absurd.
How
He's
is that not
always
absurd?
negotiating, Chuck. Chuck, he's always negotiating. That's what he does.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the reasons why so many deals for our country worked out to our benefit as compared to his predecessors, both Republican and Democrat, because he's always negotiating.
But do you realize how partisan that sounds?
That's not a partisan statement.
What is good for me is not for thee.
Listen,
he's basically saying when I'm president,
right.
There's no negotiating on this. But hey, when somebody else is president, screw him.
Well, no, here's the thing. Let's be realistic now. When Donald Trump was negotiating debt ceiling with Nancy Pelosi, mind you, they negotiated that.
No, they didn't. They raised it without any restrictions.
When they were doing that, our economy was thriving. Our debt levels were not where they are right now. We were about $24 trillion, not $32 trillion. We weren't having massive deficits the way we are right now. It was a very different environment. Now you have $32 trillion on the credit card, and all House Republicans are saying is, let's go back to pre-pandemic spending. That's common sense stuff.
But there's one more thing House Republicans are asking for, which is they want fewer IRS agents. They want fewer attempts to try to properly get tax receipts into the federal government's coffers. I have never understood the resistance of extra IRS agents unless you knowingly cheat on your taxes.
First of all, that's salacious, and you know that. Most Americans, by far, pay their taxes, and they do it honorably. What House Republicans, and frankly the Republican Party, is concerned about is having IRS agents go after middle-class families and small business owners. When you have that many more agents, it's not to go after the rich. It's to go after the middle class. That's what it's for.
So if you're paying what you're supposed to pay, then you should have nothing to fear.
You would make the assumption that IRS audits are up, that they're putting out more liens on the American people. That's not true. That data is not there. All Joe Biden's trying to do is find every possible nickel out of every couch from every American to pay for his radical spending. Why would we do that? Listen, let me contrast for you. When we passed the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, CBO said it was going to cost $2 trillion. It's actually not true. What ended up happening was the federal government took in $1 trillion more than CBO actually projected. The economy grew another 1%
fairness,
over
we can't
projections.
litigate the tax cuts because of what happened with COVID. We don't know how much this ate into everything, but it certainly looks like there were going to be fewer revenues coming into the government. But we don't know. In fairness,
fewer revenues now.
There's no ability to litigate this because of what happened with COVID and the extra spending.
That is not true, Chuck. In 2019, we took in more revenue than we ever have in the history of our nation. As much of a percentage of our economy than we ever have as a nation. That was 2019. Tax receipts are still up.
You realize that President Trump has added more to the deficit than Joe Biden.
You're
Some
gonna
of it's
use
COVID. Some of it's COVID.
Most of it is COVID.
Not
Let's be clear with the people.
Half of it's COVID and half of it's the tax cut.
That is not true because we raised more revenue. We raised more revenue than CBO projected. If you bring in more money than your projections are, how are you adding to your deficits, Chuck?
And if somehow you keep cutting taxes but more revenue comes into the government, that math doesn't work over time. You can have it in the first year due to some various accounting tricks, but it doesn't work over time.
No, Chuck, that is not true. The purpose of tax policy is to raise revenue for the federal government, not to equalize society. After the Trump tax cuts were passed, more tax revenue has come to the federal government than at any other time in the history of our nation. Those are the facts.
Raw dollars can happen because we do have
and a percentage of the economy. Both of them have.
Let me ask you this on caps.
Sure.
Do you want to see caps on defense spending as well as domestic spending? Because right now there seems to be a dispute whether there's going to be budget caps only on domestic, or Republicans are also wanting caps on defense spending.
So internally, we're having this discussion about defense. We're looking at trying to see a way to keep defense spending in line because, there are threats all over the globe. We see it in Ukraine. We see what's happening with China's saber rattling with Taiwan, et cetera. So we want to make sure that our military preparedness is where it needs to be. But at the same time, House Republicans are not looking at just letting the Department of Defense just have massive radical increases as well. We have to control spending everywhere in our government.
Let me go back to the reality of politics. Tom Cole said, any deal is going to lose people like you in the Freedom Caucus and people on the progressive side. And he added this to the dispatch. He said, we're not going to have a deal if the President of the United States doesn't sign it, and we're not going to have a deal if a majority of the House doesn't support it. So each side's not going to just simply give the other side what it wants. It's politics 101. I go back to my first question. Do you accept that premise?
I accept the premise that Joe Biden's got to come up with a deal. He doesn't have one. I would ask you should ask him, if he actually would take your question, you should ask him if he has a plan, if he has a strategy. The only thing he's ever said is it should just be clean. But nobody with an economic mind is saying, yeah, sure, just give the federal government a blank check.
So are you comfortable with breaching the debt ceiling?
No, I'm not comfortable with that. This should have been done 100 days ago. House Republicans have been working on this for 3 months. I've been in the room. I've been in those meetings. And while we were working on a strategy to raise our nation's debt ceiling, which is something the House of Representatives has passed, Joe Biden was ignoring it. And Chuck Schumer was ignoring it. And I think that he has been derelict in his duty.
Let me ask you about the presidential race. We got off more on the debt ceiling than I think either one of us expected. I want to play your celebration of Governor DeSantis and ask you about it on the other side. Here it is.
The newly re-elected, Democrat-beaten, freedom standing for America's Governor, Ron DeSantis.
Obviously, you chose to support right now Donald Trump instead of who you described as America's governor there. What could Governor DeSantis have done to convince you to stick with him and not the former president?
Well, first of all, that speech was pretty good, Chuck. You got to acknowledge that. That was good stuff. Anyway, look, to me, it's not really about Donald Trump versus Ron DeSantis. It's about what America needs. And that's where I've been really since day one. I talked a little bit about foreign policy in the last block. We have a situation right now where Russia's on the move and China is on the move. We need somebody who can step in day one, look at Vladimir Putin, look at Xi Jinping and say, okay, enough. I'm back. We're going to get everything in order the way it was.
You don't think DeSantis has
before.
that ability?
I think it's going to take him time. I think there's only one person who has that ability right now, and it's Donald Trump. And for all the naysayers who would say, oh, he's unpredictable, oh, we don't know what he's going to do, let's be very clear. When he was president of the United States, the world was in a much safer place. Nobody can say that the world is safer now than when it was when he was president.
He called January 6th a beautiful day. That is not something many people associate January 6th with. You really think that's an electable position?
Look, I think what happened on January 6th was a terrible day for the country.
You don't think it was a beautiful day?
I was on the House floor. Yeah. It was a terrible day for the country. But that also being said, we have a situation where we got to get the country back on track. I made a comment the other day that as bad as January 6th was, the American people aren't consuming January 6th the way the media in Washington is consuming January 6th. Our country has to get back on track.
Pretty scarring in Washington. In fairness to Washington, it was a pretty scarring day for Washington.
It was. It was. But what's happening at our southern border right now? That's scarring for the people who live at the southern border. What's happening for middle-income families when their wages are being eroded by a massive inflation brought to us by Joe Biden? That is the stuff that the American people are concerned about right now.
There's been some talk that you might be interested in running for governor in 2026. So let me ask you this. Would you have signed a 6-week ban, or do you think that was too much?
Honestly, that's something where you have to deal with your legislature on that. You have to look at your legislature, you have to deal with the people in your state, and you figure out what that process is going to be.
Sounds like that you think 6 weeks is too much.
Well,
You're
they also put a lot of exceptions into it.
Yeah.
Look, I wasn't in the legislation when they did this. I want to be blunt with you.
I understand.
I'm not sure where the governor was and the legislature was on this. What I will tell you is this is a far better place to be than when Roe v. Wade was the law.
Donald Trump thinks it's too much. It's too extreme. Do you agree with him on that?
I think he's going to figure out what he thinks is going to be the best thing for the country. He said that already. He's on the record with that. Look, abortion politics is very personal. It's very, very personal. And it's obviously, we all know it's hyperbolic in our country. Right. People are all over the place.
Isn't that a reason not to have government try to get so involved in it?
Well, I would argue that the Supreme Court already did that. They did that for 50 years. And that's why it was important to return this back to the states, because the country's never really had to deal with the politics of abortion. Compare us to the European countries. America's abortion policy is radical compared to the European countries. Most European countries are 10 to 12 weeks. That's where they are.
They also have exceptions that allow abortion.
The Florida law has exceptions as well.
All the way there. I'm going to do more on abortion here in a few minutes. Byron Donalds, Republican congressman from Southwest Florida. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.